Poor boy helps millionaire with flat tire. The next day, a black SUV shows up at his house. Before you start, tell me where you're watching this video from and what time it is. It was a blustery late autumn afternoon, with winds sweeping across the vast countryside, shaking the golden brown leaves clinging desperately to the trees. A narrow rural road snaked through endless fields, leading to a story that would change two lives forever. Daniel Carter, a sharply dressed man in his mid-40s, stood helplessly by his sleek black sports car. The left rear tire lay flat, a casualty of an unseen nail lodged deep within its tread. Daniel's face reflected his irritation. He was accustomed to control, his world dominated by boardroom meetings, sky-high profits, and staff who fulfilled his every need. This flat tire, in the middle of nowhere with no cell service, was a sharp contrast to his usual life of convenience. The setting felt like a cruel joke. He had just left an important conference at an exclusive retreat and was on his way back to his mansion in the city. But now, Daniel was stranded, caught between his impatience and his inability to solve this basic problem alone. He checked his phone for the 100th time, still no signal. Huffing, he leaned against his car, his irritation turning into a dull frustration. From the distance, the sound of gravel crunching beneath wheels caught his attention. A rusty, battered bicycle appeared over the horizon, its rider a boy who couldn't have been older than 12. The boy, dressed in faded jeans and a too-thin jacket for the chill, pedaled closer, his brow furrowed with curiosity. Daniel squinted at the boy, unsure whether to wave him down or ignore him. Before he could decide, the boy stopped a few feet away and dismounted. "Need help, mister?" the boy asked, brushing dark hair out of his eyes. His tone was polite but confident, showing no hesitation despite the evident disparity in their appearances. Daniel hesitated. The boy didn't look like much of a mechanic. Too young, too scrawny. "I've got a flat," Daniel said flatly, pointing to the offending tire. The boy crouched to inspect the damage. "Bad luck," he said, standing up and adjusting the strap of a frayed backpack slung over one shoulder. "But I can help. I've got a pump and a patch kit at home." Daniel frowned. "Home? How far is that?" "Just a mile up the road," the boy replied. "I'll be back quick." Before Daniel could protest, the boy hopped back onto his bicycle and disappeared down the road. For a moment, Daniel considered the absurdity of the situation, a millionaire businessman relying on a rural kid to rescue him. He shook his head and leaned back against the car, resolving to wait. True to his word, the boy returned within 15 minutes, this time with a small toolbox balanced precariously on the handlebars. He worked diligently, patching the tire with skillful precision that surprised Daniel. Despite the cold, the boy remained cheerful, occasionally humming under his breath. "You've done this before?" Daniel asked, breaking the silence. "Plenty of times," the boy replied, his hands steady. "My mom's car gets flats a lot. I always fix them." As the boy worked, Daniel observed him more closely. Beneath the boy's tattered jacket and worn-out shoes was a quiet determination that reminded Daniel of himself, long before the suits and the wealth. It was strange how such a small, unassuming act of kindness could stir something so unexpected. When the job was done, Daniel offered the boy a $50 bill. The boy shook his head firmly. "No thanks," he said with a smile. "Helping is enough." Daniel was stunned. Who turned down money like that? As the boy mounted his bike to leave, he looked back over his shoulder. "Hope you have a safe trip." And then he was gone. Daniel stood by his car, the crisp bill still clutched in his hand, watching the boy disappear into the horizon. Something about the encounter left him unsettled, a gnawing feeling that lingered even as he drove off into the dusk. Daniel Carter's life was meticulously constructed to mirror success, or at least what the world defined as success. As he drove away from the rural stretch of road, his car humming along the smooth asphalt, his thoughts lingered on the peculiar boy who had helped him. Daniel shook his head and glanced at the dashboard's glowing GPS, eager to re-immerse himself in the trappings of his well-oiled life. Back in the city, Daniel was known for his business acumen and luxury lifestyle. His penthouse apartment overlooked a sprawling skyline, and his wardrobe brimmed with designer suits. Every detail of his world exuded wealth and precision, from the handcrafted Italian coffee machine in his kitchen to the sleek desk in his office, where deals worth millions were sealed with a flourish of his signature. But beneath the veneer of perfection was an emptiness that Daniel rarely acknowledged. His phone rarely buzzed with personal calls, and the echo of his steps in his vast apartment often felt deafening. He had built an empire, yet his relationships had crumbled under the weight of his ambition. Friends had drifted away, lovers had left, and even his family connections had grown strained over the years. As Daniel pulled into the underground parking garage of his building, the silence in the car felt heavier than usual. He remembered the boy's refusal to take the $50 bill, a gesture so foreign to Daniel's worldview that it unsettled him deeply. Who turns down money, especially when it's offered so freely? He shook off the thought and rode the elevator to his penthouse. Yet, as he poured himself a glass of scotch and gazed out at the glittering city lights, Daniel found himself distracted by the memory of the boy's earnest smile and unassuming demeanor. Daniel didn't realize it yet, but that brief encounter on the rural road had planted a seed in his heart. For the first time in years, he felt a nagging dissatisfaction with his carefully curated life, and the faint stirrings of change began to creep into his soul. The next morning, Daniel woke early, restless, and unable to shake the lingering thoughts of the boy. As sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, he sat at his polished dining table, absent-mindedly stirring his coffee. His mind replayed the previous day, the boy's unprompted kindness, the simple yet confident way he handled the tire, and the look in his eyes when he turned down the money. Daniel's life had taught him to believe that everything came with a price. The idea of someone helping purely out of goodwill felt like a fairy tale, a relic of a world he no longer believed in. But there was something unsettlingly genuine about the boy, a purity that Daniel couldn't reconcile with his own hardened worldview. He picked up his phone, scrolling through his calendar filled with meetings and deadlines. He had every reason to dive into his work and forget the whole episode, but a nagging feeling wouldn't let him. As he scrolled further, his eyes landed on the anniversary date of his father's death, a sobering reminder of the man who had once inspired him. His father, George Carter, had been the opposite of Daniel. Though not wealthy, he had been known for his compassion and unwavering belief in helping others. Daniel's childhood had been peppered with memories of his father fixing neighbors' roofs, lending money to struggling friends, and encouraging Daniel to leave the world a little brighter than he found it. But life had been cruel to George. His relentless kindness often went unrewarded, and after his untimely death, Daniel vowed never to walk that same path of vulnerability. He pursued wealth, power, and self-reliance with a fervor that left little room for anything or anyone else. Now, decades later, Daniel sat in the lap of luxury, haunted by the simple act of kindness from a boy who reminded him too much of his father. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: doubt. What if he had been wrong all along? What if there was more to life than he'd let himself believe? John Parker pedaled his bike briskly down the narrow dirt road, the crisp morning air stinging his cheeks. The boy's home, a modest shack on the outskirts of the countryside, sat nestled among overgrown weeds and leaning wooden fences. It wasn't much, but to John and his mother, Lily, it was home. The roof leaked during heavy rains, the plumbing was temperamental, and the windows rattled whenever the wind picked up, but it was all they could afford. John's life was a patchwork of small routines and hard lessons. His mornings were spent helping his mother with chores before heading off to school, and his afternoons were often dedicated to odd jobs around the neighborhood. He fixed bikes, mended fences, and occasionally ran errands for their elderly neighbor, Mr. Grayson, who rewarded him with warm cookies or a few spare dollars. Every penny John earned went toward keeping the lights on and food on the table. The previous day's encounter with Daniel felt like an unexpected detour in John's otherwise predictable life. He'd noticed the shiny black car stranded by the roadside and stopped without a second thought. Helping people was as natural to John as breathing. He didn't see it as an inconvenience, just something you did when someone was in trouble. That morning, as he sat at the rickety kitchen table, sipping a cup of watery oatmeal, John shared the story with his mother. Lily listened with a tired smile, her hands working deftly to sew a patch onto John's jacket. "That was kind of you, John," she said softly, her eyes filled with both pride and worry. "But you didn't have to refuse the money. We could have used it." "I know," John replied, lowering his gaze. "But it didn't feel right. He needed help, and I just wanted to help." Lily reached over, brushing a hand through his unruly hair. "You've got a good heart, kid. Don't ever lose that." John grinned, though he couldn't quite explain the satisfaction he felt. It wasn't about the money, it was about something deeper, a feeling of doing the right thing, no matter how small. As Daniel drove into the city that same morning, the boy's image remained vivid in his mind. The tousled hair, the patched-up jacket, the earnest smile, it all clashed sharply with the opulence of his world. It wasn't just the boy's refusal of money that struck him, it was the ease with which he'd offered help, as if it were second nature. Daniel glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror, his tailored suit crisp and pristine. A faint scowl shadowed his face. He had spent his entire life cultivating an image of success, yet that boy, who had so little, seemed richer in ways Daniel couldn't articulate. By the time he reached his office, a towering building of steel and glass in the heart of the financial district, Daniel was distracted. Meetings came and went, but he barely listened, his thoughts drifting back to the rural road and the boy with the rusty bike. During lunch, he found himself staring out the window, his untouched meal growing cold on the plate. One of his assistants noticed. "Everything all right, Mr. Carter?" Daniel snapped out of his daze. "Fine," he replied tersely, but his mind was anything but fine. That evening, he poured himself a drink and sat in his living room, the city lights twinkling like distant stars through the panoramic windows. The vast silence of his penthouse was suffocating. He flipped through channels on the oversized TV, but nothing held his attention. Finally, he set down the remote and leaned back, his thoughts spiraling. For years, Daniel had equated worth with wealth. But the boy's simple act of kindness had unraveled that belief in a matter of minutes. What if the pursuit of more money, more power, more status, had blinded him to what truly mattered? For the first time in decades, Daniel felt small, vulnerable, and profoundly alone. In that quiet moment of reflection, the idea came to him. He needed to find the boy, not for closure, but because he couldn't ignore the growing urge to understand the life of someone so willing to give without asking for anything in return. Daniel's decision to find the boy wasn't born of charity or obligation. It was something deeper, a gnawing sensation in his chest that demanded resolution. He couldn't stop replaying their encounter in his mind, the boy's unassuming sincerity contrasting so starkly with the transactional world Daniel inhabited. The next morning, he canceled his meetings, something he never did, and set off for the countryside. Driving his sleek car down the same narrow road, he felt a strange sense of apprehension. What was he even hoping to accomplish? The boy had done his part, moved on, and likely forgotten the entire incident. But for Daniel, it had become an obsession. As he approached the spot where he'd been stranded, Daniel slowed the car, scanning the horizon. The fields looked unchanged, the wind teasing the tall grass into waves. He remembered the boy saying his home was just a mile up the road. Following the vague direction, Daniel drove until he spotted a weather house tucked behind a crooked fence. He parked the car and hesitated before stepping out. The house was modest, small, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. A rusty bike leaned against the side, its chain glinting faintly in the sunlight. Daniel felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Was it pity, guilt, or perhaps envy for a simplicity he had long forgotten? As he walked up the uneven path, he rehearsed what he might say, but the words felt hollow. His polished shoes crunched against the gravel as he approached the door. He raised a hand to knock but paused, the weight of his own uncertainty paralyzing him. Inside the house, John was helping his mother sort through a pile of donated clothes. Hearing the knock, he sprang to his feet and opened the door, his expression shifting from surprise to recognition. "Hey, misters," John exclaimed, smiling. "What brings you out here?" Daniel stared at the boy, suddenly feeling out of place in his expensive suit. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said, though he knew it wasn't the whole truth. John's smile widened, but there was a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "Thank me? You already did, remembers?" He stepped aside, motioning for Daniel to enter. "Come in if you want. It's cold out." Daniel hesitated, but finally crossed the threshold. The interior of the house was modest, yet warm. The walls were adorned with family photos, some yellowed with age, and the furniture, though worn, was clean and neatly arranged. A faint aroma of fresh bread filled the air, and a small heater hummed in the corner. John's mother, Lily, appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Her kind eyes lit up with surprise as she saw their guest.
"Oh,
"You must be the man John was talking about. The one with the car troubles." Daniel nodded, feeling slightly uncomfortable under her gaze. He wasn't used to such genuine hospitality. "Yes, that was me. I wanted to thank John again for helping me." "You're very kind to come all this way," Lily said, gesturing toward a chair.
please sit."
"Would you like some tea?" "No, thank you," Daniel replied, though he sat anyway, unsure how to proceed. John plopped down on the couch opposite Daniel, his hands clasped together excitedly. "Did the patch hold up?" "I told you it would. It's a good one." "It did," Daniel said, managing a small smile. "You did a great job. I came to tell you that." Lily watched the exchange quietly, sensing something unspoken in Daniel's demeanor. "It's not often we get visitors out here," she said gently. "Especially someone like you." Daniel felt the weight of her words. Looking around, he noticed the signs of struggle, threadbare rugs, mismatched dishes, and an air of quiet resilience. It reminded him of his own childhood, though he had worked hard to forget those years. "I was hoping to help," Daniel said finally, his voice softer than usual. "You've been so kind, and I'd like to do something in return." Lily's smile faltered, replaced by a mix of gratitude and suspicion. "We don't need anything," she said, though her tone wasn't firm. Daniel leaned forward, meeting her gaze. "Maybe not, but sometimes it's okay to accept help." Lily studied Daniel for a moment, her hands nervously fidgeting with the edge of her apron. She had spent years teaching herself to say no to offers of help, pride and necessity intertwined in her resolve. But something in Daniel's expression, a vulnerability hidden beneath the polished exterior, softened her resistance. "Well," she said after a pause, "if you're serious about helping, maybe you'd like to see how we live. That's the best way to understand." John's face lit up. "I can show him, Mom," he said eagerly, hopping up from the couch. "Come on, misters." Daniel rose to follow the boy, unsure of what to expect. They moved through the house, each room telling a story of resilience. The kitchen, small but tidy, had a leaky faucet and a stove that looked older than Daniel. The bedrooms were modest, with patched quilts and second-hand furniture. The most jarring sight was the roof, visible through a crack in the ceiling of John's room. "Rain gets in sometimes," John said casually, as if it were an unremarkable fact of life. "We just put buckets underneath. Works fine." Daniel nodded, though his chest tightened. He remembered similar conditions from his own childhood, sleeping on a mattress so thin the springs poked through, watching his parents juggle bills, and pretending it didn't bother him when friends teased him for his clothes. "You've got a nice home," Daniel said, the words feeling inadequate. "Mom works real hard to keep it nice," John replied, puffing his chest with pride. "She's the best." Back in the living room, Lily had set out a plate of bread and butter, her way of being hospitable despite their limited means. Daniel sat down again, his mind racing. He had come here expecting to leave after a polite thank you, but now he felt an undeniable urge to do more. "John told me you don't take handouts," Daniel said to Lily, his voice steady. "But what if I offered something different? Not charity, but a way to make things better?" Lily's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Daniel smiled faintly. "I'd like to help fix this house." Lily stared at Daniel, her expression caught between disbelief and hesitation. "Fix the house?" she repeated, her voice faltering. "That's a kind offer, but we couldn't possibly afford something like that." "It's not about what you can afford," Daniel said gently, leaning forward. "It's about what I can do." Think of it as a thank you for what John did for me. Lily glanced at John, who was practically bouncing with excitement, then back at Daniel. It's a big project, she said cautiously. This house has been falling apart for years. Then it's long overdue, Daniel replied, his tone decisive. Let me handle it. Over the next few days, plans began to take shape. Daniel hired contractors, but he didn't delegate entirely. He showed up every morning, rolling up his sleeves and diving into the work himself. For the first time in years, he traded his suits for jeans and work boots, finding a strange satisfaction in the physical labor. The house was transformed in phases. The cracked roof was replaced first, its sturdy shingles gleaming under the sun. Inside, the sagging floorboards were reinforced, and fresh coats of paint brought life to the once dull walls. The kitchen was fitted with a new stove, and the leaky faucet was replaced with a shiny, modern one. John was fascinated by the process, following Daniel around like a shadow. You really know how to do this stuff? He asked one day, watching Daniel sand a wooden frame. Not at first, Daniel admitted, smiling. But I've learned a thing or two. Hard work pays off. Lily was overwhelmed by the transformation. She'd catch glimpses of Daniel hammering nails or discussing blueprints with the contractors and marvel at his dedication. What surprised her most was the care he put into every detail, as if he were building the home for himself. For Daniel, the renovation became more than just a project. It was a journey of rediscovery. Each nail he hammered felt like a step toward repairing not just the house, but parts of himself he hadn't realized were broken. As the days turned into weeks, the renovation became a communal effort. The contractors worked tirelessly, but Daniel and John were inseparable, sharing small tasks that allowed their bond to grow. Daniel found himself amazed by the boys' relentless energy and curiosity, while John seemed equally fascinated by Daniel's stories of city life and his business ventures. One evening, after the workers had gone home, John sat beside Daniel on the porch steps of the house. The sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, the air filled with the scent of fresh timber. Thanks for doing all this, John said suddenly, his voice quiet but sincere. Mom and I never thought we'd see the house like this. Daniel glanced at him, a small smile playing on his lips. You're the reason I'm doing it, you know. Me? John asked, his brow furrowing. Daniel nodded. You reminded me of something I lost a long time ago. When I was your age, I didn't have much either. My dad worked hard, but we struggled. He always told me to help others whenever I could, but somewhere along the way, I forgot that. John tilted his head, curious. Why'd you forget? Daniel sighed, his gaze distant. I got caught up in other things, money, success, proving myself. It all felt important, but I guess it's not as important as I thought. John smiled thoughtfully, kicking his feet against the step. I think you're helping people now. That's what matters, right? Daniel looked at the boy, struck by the simplicity and truth of his words. Yeah, he said softly. That's what matters. The conversation lingered with Daniel long after John went to bed. He realized that in helping to rebuild the house, he wasn't just giving something to John's family. He was finding something he'd been missing in his own life: connection, purpose, and a sense of belonging. The bond between them deepened with every passing day, leaving Daniel more determined than ever to make the house, and their lives, better than before. The day the renovations neared completion, Daniel stood in what had once been the cracked and drafty living room. Now, sunlight streamed through newly installed windows, illuminating the smooth wooden floors and freshly painted walls. A sense of pride and fulfillment filled him, but it was more than the satisfaction of a job well done. It was a realization of how far he had come, not just as a benefactor, but as a person. John ran in from the kitchen, where Lily was baking a celebratory pie in their gleaming new oven. It looks amazing, doesn't it? He said, spinning around the room with boundless enthusiasm. It's like a whole new house. Daniel chuckled, watching the boy. It is a whole new house. But you know what really makes it special? John stopped spinning and tilted his head. What? It's the people who live here. This house was already full of love and warmth. You and your mom just needed a little help to show it off. John grinned, but his face turned serious after a moment. Why'd you do all this, Daniel? I mean, really? Was it just to thank me? The question gave Daniel pause. He sank into a chair, gesturing for John to join him. At first, it was about thanking you. But as I spent more time here, seeing how hard your mom works, how much you care about each other, I realized it wasn't just about gratitude. It was about something I'd been missing in my own life. Like what? John asked. Purpose, Daniel said simply. For years, I thought making money and living in luxury would make me happy. But it didn't. Then I met you, and you reminded me what really matters. Helping others, making a difference, and being part of something bigger than yourself. John nodded thoughtfully. So, fixing the house fixed you too? Daniel smiled. I think it did. The boy's words, so simple yet profound, crystallized Daniel's journey. The house was more than a gift. It was a symbol of redemption, proof that a single act of kindness could ripple outward and change lives, including his own. The final day of renovations was a celebration in itself. Contractors worked in tandem to finish the last touches, hanging curtains in the bright new windows and arranging furniture that had been donated by kind-hearted neighbors. The once dilapidated house now stood as a beacon of transformation. Its freshly painted walls gleamed in the sunlight, and a new roof promised years of protection against the elements. Daniel stood outside with John and Lily, watching as the last crew packed up their tools. A wave of emotion washed over him, a blend of satisfaction and bittersweet nostalgia. He hadn't felt this connected to a place or people in years. Lily turned to him, her eyes brimming with tears. I don't have the words to thank you for what you've done. This house feels like a dream. You didn't just fix it, you gave us a future? Daniel smiled warmly. You've already thanked me more than enough, Lily. Your kindness and resilience reminded me of things I'd forgotten. I should be thanking you. John tugged on Daniel's sleeve, pointing to the porch. Look, even the old swing works now. He raced over and leapt onto the newly reinforced wooden swing, his laughter echoing in the air. Daniel chuckled. That swing almost took me out the first day I saw it. I thought it was going to snap. Lily joined in the laughter, but her voice softened as she spoke. You've given us so much more than a new house, Daniel. You've reminded us that there are still good people out there who care. Daniel looked at her, humbled by the sincerity in her words. He realized that the transformation wasn't just in the house or the family, it was in him. For years, he had lived in isolation, surrounded by luxury yet disconnected from humanity. Now he felt like a part of something real, something meaningful. As the sun began to set, the house stood tall and proud, its transformation complete. But for Daniel, it was only the beginning of a new chapter, one where his life would be driven not by profit, but by purpose. The day after the renovation was completed, Daniel returned to the house one last time. He arrived early in the morning, carrying an envelope in his hand and a nervous energy he wasn't used to feeling. The family was still getting used to their new surroundings, but the sight of Daniel pulling up in his sleek car brought smiles to both John and Lily. Daniel! John yelled, running to greet him. You're back. Did you come to see the house again? In a way, Daniel said, smiling as he ruffled John's hair. But I also have something important to give you and your mom. Lily stepped onto the porch, her hands wiping flour from her apron. What's this about? She asked with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Daniel handed her the envelope, and her brow furrowed as she opened it. Inside was a legal document, a trust fund, set up in John's name, with enough money to secure their future. The sum wasn't extravagant, but it was more than enough to cover college tuition, repairs for years to come, and a financial safety net. Lily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Daniel, this is too much. We can't accept this. You can, Daniel said firmly. And you will. This isn't charity, it's an investment in the future. John has so much potential, and I want to make sure he gets every opportunity to use it. John peeked over his mother's shoulder, his eyes widening when he saw the numbers. Does this mean I can go to college? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Absolutely, Daniel said, kneeling to meet John's gaze. You can do anything you set your mind to, and now you don't have to worry about how to get there. Tears streamed down Lily's face as she clutched the envelope. I don't know how to thank you, she said, her voice trembling. Daniel smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. You already have. Helping your family has been the best thing I've ever done. News of the house transformation and Daniel's generosity spread quickly through the small community. Neighbors who had once kept their distance, too busy with their own struggles, now gathered around John and Lily's newly restored home to celebrate. It was more than just a housewarming. It was a testament to the power of kindness and the ripple effect of good deeds. Lily had baked her famous pies, and John raced around offering slices to anyone who would take one. Children played on the newly repaired porch swing while adults marveled at the house's fresh coat of paint and sturdy new roof. The once quiet property buzzed with laughter and conversation. Daniel stood to the side, taking it all in. For years, his life had revolved around deals made behind closed doors and celebrations limited to exclusive circles. This was different. This was real. He found himself smiling at the simple joy of people coming together. An elderly man approached Daniel, his handshake firm but warm. You're a good man, he said, his voice thick with emotion. We don't see this kind of generosity often around here. Thank you for what you've done for Lily and John. Daniel nodded, humbled. I think they've done more for me than I have for them. John darted up to Daniel, his face flushed with excitement. Did you see the swing, Daniel? Everyone loves it. And Mom's pies are all gone already. That's because they're the best pies in town, Daniel replied with a laugh. John tugged on Daniel's sleeve, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. Do you think we can help other people too? Like you helped us? Daniel knelt down, resting a hand on John's shoulder. I think you're going to help a lot of people one day, John. You've got the heart for it. As the evening stretched on, Daniel felt a profound sense of belonging, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. The community's warmth enveloped him, and for the first time, he understood the true wealth of human connection. When the celebration wound down and the last of the neighbors had left, Daniel stayed behind. The house, now quiet, looked like a beacon under the glow of the moonlight. Inside, John had already fallen asleep, curled up on the couch with a blanket draped over him. Lily was in the kitchen, tidying up from the day's festivities. Daniel stood in the living room, his hands in his pockets, looking at the space that had once been so worn and tired. It wasn't just the house that had been rebuilt. Something within him had shifted, too. Lily walked in, drying her hands on a towel. You don't have to stay and clean up, you know, she said with a soft smile. Daniel chuckled. I know. I just needed a moment. Lily nodded, sensing the weight of his thoughts. She sat down across from him, her eyes warm and understanding. You've done something amazing here, Daniel. Not just for us, for yourself too, haven't you? He met her gaze, the words forming in his mind before he even realized he was speaking. I think I've spent so much of my life chasing things that don't matter. Money, power, success that all felt so important. But none of it made me happy. What does? Lily asked gently. Daniel looked around the room, his eyes landing on the photographs of John and Lily, now placed proudly on a refurbished shelf.
This. People.
Connection.
Purpose.
I didn't realize how much I'd lost until I met you and John. Lily reached out and placed a hand on his. It's never too late to find your way back. Daniel nodded, his chest tightening with emotion. He had come here expecting to fix a house, but in truth, he had repaired himself. As he stood to leave, he glanced at John, still sound asleep, and felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Thank you, Daniel said quietly, for letting me be part of your lives. And thank you, Lily replied, for giving us a chance to dream again. The next morning, Daniel returned to the house for a quiet goodbye. He had accomplished what he'd set out to do and more, but there was one last conversation he wanted to have before leaving. John was already up, sitting cross-legged on the porch and working on the old bike that had first brought him to Daniel's attention. The rusty frame gleamed with new paint, and John was focused on tightening the bolts of the handlebars with a wrench. Morning, John, Daniel said, walking up with a smile. John looked up, his face brightening. Morning. Look, I'm fixing it up. Mom said I should probably get a new bike, but I like this one. It just needs a little care. Daniel chuckled and crouched down beside him. You're a lot like your mom, you know. Always making the most of what you have. John shrugged, a thoughtful look crossing his face. I guess so. But I was thinking maybe when I grow up, I can do stuff like you. Stuff like me? Daniel asked, intrigued. Yeah, John said, his voice growing more animated. Helping people. Fixing things that are broken. Not just bikes or houses, but like people's lives too. You've helped us so much, and I want to do that for other families someday. Daniel felt a lump in his throat, his chest tightening with pride. That's a pretty big dream, John. John looked at him earnestly. Isn't that what you always say? Dream big. Daniel smiled, ruffling John's hair. I do say that. And I think you're going to make a lot of dreams come true, not just your own. John grinned, his excitement contagious. Do you think so? I know so, Daniel replied. You've got the heart, the determination, and now the opportunities. The world's going to be lucky to have you. For Daniel, hearing John's aspirations felt like the perfect culmination of everything he'd worked for. The boy's words affirmed that this wasn't just an end but the beginning of a legacy, a ripple of kindness that would continue far beyond them both. As the sun rose higher, painting the fields with golden light, Daniel stood by his car, ready to leave. John and Lily were at the edge of the driveway, waving, their smiles wide and full of warmth. The house behind them was a testament to transformation, not just of brick and wood, but of lives intertwined by a chance encounter. Promise you'll visit again, John called out, shielding his eyes from the sunlight. I will, Daniel assured him. And don't forget, you've got my number if you ever need anything. John nodded enthusiastically, but Daniel could see that the boy's confidence had grown. It wasn't just the new house or the trust fund. It was the belief in a future that held possibilities he'd never dared to imagine before. Lily stepped forward, her hands clasped together. Daniel, I know you said not to keep thanking you, but I need to say it one more time. You didn't just give us a better house. You gave us hope. Daniel felt a swell of emotion, but he kept his voice steady. You gave me hope too, Lily. This has been as much for me as it has been for you. With one last wave, Daniel climbed into his car and started down the long, winding road back to the city. The countryside faded into the rearview mirror, but the sense of belonging and purpose lingered in his heart. He thought about all the decisions that had led him here, from the flat tire to John's selfless help, and he realized how small moments could change the course of a life. He no longer felt the empty ache of his old routines. Instead, he was filled with the knowledge that he had made a difference and could continue to do so. As Daniel merged onto the highway, he glanced at the empty passenger seat and smiled to himself. This was not the end of the journey. It was just the beginning. For John, for Lily, and for himself, there was a future filled with promise, fueled by the simple but profound act of kindness that had started it all. As Daniel drove back to the city, his mind wandered to moments from his past, flashbacks that now felt clearer in light of his recent experiences. He remembered his father, George, working late into the night on their crumbling house, hands rough but determined. George's laughter still echoed in his memory, even when life was hardest. One particular memory surfaced, George giving their last few dollars to a neighbor in need. At the time, young Daniel had been angry. "We need that more than they do," he'd shouted. But George had simply smiled and said, "Kindness always comes back, son. Maybe not in the way you expect, but it does." Daniel realized he had spent his life running from that lesson, determined to succeed on his own terms. Yet here he was, finding solace and purpose in the very principle he had once rejected. His father had been right all along. The morning before Daniel left, John and Daniel had a candid conversation that stayed with him. It was quiet in the kitchen, the scent of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. "Daniel," John said hesitantly, stirring a glass of milk, "were you ever scared when you were my age? About the future, I mean..." Daniel put down his coffee mug, his expression softening. "All the time, John. My dad used to tell me it was okay to be scared as long as I didn't let it stop me. But I didn't always listen. I spent too much of my life chasing things to prove I wasn't afraid. John's brow furrowed. Did it work? No, Daniel admitted with a chuckle. What works is doing something meaningful, like helping others. You taught me that. John beamed, his confidence growing. The bond between them deepened in that simple exchange of wisdom and honesty. The contrast between Daniel's former life and the one he glimpsed with John's family was stark, yet profoundly transformative. In the city, Daniel's world had been defined by sterile perfection. The glittering glass walls of his penthouse, the sleek black car parked in a silent garage, and the hollow echoes of solitude within rooms too large for one man. His days had been a blur of meetings and transactions, where emotions were masked and human connection felt like a liability. Out in the countryside, everything was different. The bright chatter of children playing on John's newly repaired porch swing, the scent of fresh pies wafting from Lily's modest kitchen, and the laughter of neighbors coming together in celebration. All of it was raw, messy, and alive. As Daniel drove away, the image of their vibrant home lingered in his mind. It was a reminder that wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in moments that connected hearts.